The vanishing years. There exists in the vast timeline of human history a period so puzzling and so strange that scholars have spent lifetimes trying to understand what truly happened during those 100 years. This era, stretching roughly from the years 1200 to 1100 BCE, stands as one of the greatest mysteries our species has ever faced. It was a time when the world seemed to collapse all at once, when great civilizations that had stood for centuries suddenly disappeared, and when the lights of culture and learning dimmed across entire continents. Historians call this the Bronze Age collapse, but that name barely captures the terror and confusion that must have swept through the ancient world during this unknown century. Before this dark period began, the Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds were thriving in ways that would not be seen again for many centuries. Great kingdoms traded with one another across vast distances. Egyptian pharaohs exchanged letters with Hittite kings as equals. Mycenaean Greeks built massive palaces decorated with beautiful frescoes. The Minoans on Crete created art so advanced that it still amazes us today. Cities flourished with thousands of people living behind protective walls. Writing systems recorded everything from royal decrees to shopping lists. Bronze weapons and tools made life easier and armies stronger. Ships carried goods from one end of the known world to the other. It seemed like human civilization had reached a peak that would only grow higher. But then something went terribly wrong. Within the span of just a few generations, almost everything collapsed. Cities that had stood for hundreds of years were burned and abandoned. Palaces crumbled into ruins. Trade networks that had connected distant lands fell apart completely. Writing itself disappeared from entire regions, and people forgot how to read and write. Populations shrank dramatically as people died or scattered into the countryside. The great kingdoms that had seemed so powerful simply ceased to exist. It was as if someone had turned off the lights of civilization across a huge part of the world, and darkness descended for 100 years or more. What makes this century so mysterious is that we still do not fully understand why it happened. Unlike other dark periods in history where we know the causes, this collapse remains wrapped in shadows and uncertainty. Archaeologists dig through the ruins of destroyed cities and find evidence of violence and fire, but they cannot always tell us who did the destroying or why. Ancient texts from the few places that survived mention invasions and disasters, but the accounts are fragmentary and confusing. Modern scholars have proposed many theories, from climate change to earthquakes to mysterious invaders. But none of these explanations seems to account for everything that happened. The truth is that multiple disasters probably struck at once, creating a perfect storm that swept away the old world. The world before the darkness. To understand how devastating this unknown century was, we must first look at the world that existed before it fell. The Late Bronze Age, from about 1500 to 1200 BCE, was an era of incredible achievement and connection. The Eastern Mediterranean and Near East worlds formed what historians called the First International System, where different kingdoms and empires interacted regularly through trade, diplomacy, and sometimes war. At the heart of this system stood several great powers, each controlling vast territories and commanding the loyalty of millions of people. Egypt during this period was at the height of its new kingdom glory. Pharaohs like Ramesses II built enormous temples and statues that still stand today. The Egyptian empire stretched from Nubia in the south to Syria in the north. Egyptian merchants traded for cedar wood from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, and tin from far beyond their borders. The Egyptian pharaohs maintained a sophisticated diplomatic service that exchanged letters with other rulers in Akkadian, the international language of the time. Egyptian gold was legendary throughout the ancient world, and other kings begged for it in their letters. The Egyptian military was professional and well-equipped, with chariots and bronze weapons that made them feared across the region. To the north, in Anatolia, the Hittite Empire ruled over a huge territory from their capital at Hattusa. The Hittites were master metallurgists who may have been among the first to work with iron, though they still relied primarily on bronze. Their empire included many different peoples and languages, all held together by military might and diplomatic skill. Hittite kings corresponded with Egyptian pharaohs as equals, and the two powers eventually made peace after fighting over control of Syria. The Hittites developed a sophisticated legal system and kept extensive archives written on clay tablets. Their capital city featured massive walls and impressive temples. For hundreds of years, the Hittite Empire seemed unshakable. Across the Aegean Sea, the Mycenaean Greeks built their own civilization that combined military prowess with artistic achievement. From fortified palaces at Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and other sites, warrior kings ruled over territories they controlled through a complex administrative system. The Mycenaeans kept detailed records using a writing system called Linear B, which recorded an early form of the Greek language. These records tell us about a society organized around palace centers that controlled agriculture, craft production, and trade. Mycenaean traders sailed throughout the Mediterranean, and their pottery has been found in sites from Italy to Egypt to the Levant. The Mycenaeans were also warriors, and legends of their exploits may have inspired the later stories of the Trojan War that Homer would write about centuries later. Beyond the royal courts, ordinary people also participated in this interconnected world. Merchants traveled long distances carrying goods to trade. Craftsmen learned techniques from foreign lands and incorporated them into their work. Scribes who could write in multiple languages found employment as translators and diplomatic secretaries. Sailors and ship captains gained knowledge of distant ports and trade winds. Soldiers who served as mercenaries in foreign armies brought back stories and ideas from far away. Even slaves and prisoners of war carried cultural practices from one place to another. This movement of people created a cosmopolitan atmosphere in many cities, where different languages and customs mixed together. The interconnection extended to technology and ideas as well. Bronze working techniques spread throughout the region, with craftsmen sharing knowledge about alloy ratios and casting methods. Architectural styles influenced one another as builders saw foreign structures and adapted elements they liked. Religious concepts traveled along trade routes, with gods and goddesses from one culture sometimes being adopted or merged with deities in another. Writing systems inspired one another as people who saw the usefulness of recording information developed their own scripts based on foreign models. Medical knowledge, mathematical concepts, and agricultural techniques all circulated through this ancient network. The late Bronze Age world was truly an international civilization. The first trimmers. The collapse did not happen overnight but unfolded across several generations starting around 1200 BCE. The first signs of trouble appeared in different places at different times, like cracks spreading through the foundation of a great building. In some regions, evidence suggests that climate began to change in ways that disrupted agriculture. Studies of ancient pollen and sediment show that rainfall decreased in many areas around the Mediterranean and Near East. Rivers that had reliably flooded fields shrank to lower levels. Springs and wells that had provided water for generations began to fail. Crops that had grown easily in previous centuries struggled in the drier conditions. These climate problems created food shortages that rippled through societies. When harvests failed, farmers could not pay their taxes or tribute to the palaces and temples. Without these resources, rulers struggled to maintain their armies, support their craftsmen, and conduct diplomatic relations. Food shortages led to hunger and desperation among common people. Hungry populations became restless and harder to control. Some people abandoned their homes and migrated to other regions in search of better conditions. This migration put pressure on the places where they arrived, creating conflicts over resources. What had been a stable world began to shake. At the same time, evidence suggests that earthquakes struck many important cities and regions during this period. The eastern Mediterranean sits on several fault lines where tectonic plates meet and seismic activity is common. Archaeological excavations at multiple sites have found evidence of destruction that looks like earthquake damage from around this time. Walls toppled, columns fell, and buildings collapsed in ways that suggest violent shaking rather than human attack. A single earthquake might destroy one city, but a series of earthquakes over several decades could devastate an entire region. If major quakes struck at a time when societies were already stressed by climate change and food shortages, the combination could be catastrophic. The palaces and temples that formed the centers of Bronze Age civilization were particularly vulnerable to these problems. These institutions required constant supplies of food, raw materials, and labor to function. They depended on a complex system of taxation and tribute collection that only worked when the economy was healthy. When climate change reduced agricultural output and earthquakes damaged infrastructure, the whole system began to break down. Palace administrators found it harder to collect what they needed. They could not pay workers or support craftsmen. Trade decreased because there were fewer goods to exchange and fewer resources to pay for imports. The palace-centered economies that had worked so well for centuries suddenly seemed fragile and vulnerable. The unknown century. The collapse did not happen overnight, but unfolded across several generations starting around 1200 BCE. The first signs of trouble appeared in different places at different times, like cracks spreading through the foundation of a great building. In some regions, evidence suggests that climate began to change in ways that disrupted agriculture. Studies of ancient pollen and sediment show that rainfall decreased in many areas around the Mediterranean and Near East. Rivers that had reliably flooded fields shrank to lower levels. Springs and wells that had provided water for generations began to fail. Crops that had grown easily in previous centuries struggled in the drier conditions. These climate problems created food shortages that rippled through societies. When harvests failed, farmers could not pay their taxes or tribute to the palaces and temples. Without these resources, rulers struggled to maintain their armies, support their craftsmen, and conduct diplomatic relations. Food shortages led to hunger and desperation among common people. Hungry populations became restless and harder to control. Some people abandoned their homes and migrated to other regions in search of better conditions. This migration put pressure on the places where they arrived, creating conflicts over resources. What had been a stable world began to shake. At the same time, evidence suggests that earthquakes struck many important cities and regions during this period. The eastern Mediterranean sits on several fault lines where tectonic plates meet and seismic activity is common. Archaeological excavations at multiple sites have found evidence of destruction that looks like earthquake damage from around this time. Walls toppled, columns fell, and buildings collapsed in ways that suggest violent shaking rather than human attack. A single earthquake might destroy one city, but a series of earthquakes over several decades could devastate an entire region. If major quakes struck at a time when societies were already stressed by climate change and food shortages, the combination could be catastrophic. The palaces and temples that formed the centers of Bronze Age civilization were particularly vulnerable to these problems. These institutions required constant supplies of food, raw materials, and labor to function. They depended on a complex system of taxation and tribute collection that only worked when the economy was healthy. When climate change reduced agricultural output and earthquakes damaged infrastructure, the whole system began to break down. Palace administrators found it harder to collect what they needed. They could not pay workers or support craftsmen. Trade decreased because there were fewer goods to exchange and fewer resources to pay for imports. The palace-centered economies that had worked so well for centuries suddenly seemed fragile and vulnerable. The unknown century. The collapse did not happen overnight, but unfolded across several generations starting around 1200 BCE. The first signs of trouble appeared in different places at different times, like cracks spreading through the foundation of a great building. In some regions, evidence suggests that climate began to change in ways that disrupted agriculture. Studies of ancient pollen and sediment show that rainfall decreased in many areas around the Mediterranean and Near East. Rivers that had reliably flooded fields shrank to lower levels.
Springs and wells that had provided water for generations began to fail. Crops that had grown easily in previous centuries struggled in the drier conditions. These climate problems created food shortages that rippled through societies. When harvests failed, farmers could not pay their taxes or tribute to the palaces and temples. Without these resources, rulers struggled to maintain their armies, support their craftsmen, and conduct diplomatic relations. Food shortages led to hunger and desperation among common people. Hungry populations became restless and harder to control. Some people abandoned their homes and migrated to other regions in search of better conditions. This migration put pressure on the places where they arrived, creating conflicts over resources. What had been a stable world began to shake. At the same time, evidence suggests that earthquakes struck many important cities and regions during this period. The eastern Mediterranean sits on several fault lines where tectonic plates meet and seismic activity is common. Archaeological excavations at multiple sites have found evidence of destruction that looks like earthquake damage from around this time. Walls toppled, columns fell, and buildings collapsed in ways that suggest violent shaking rather than human attack. A single earthquake might destroy one city, but a series of earthquakes over several decades could devastate an entire region. If major quakes struck at a time when societies were already stressed by climate change and food shortages, the combination could be catastrophic. The palaces and temples that formed the centers of Bronze Age civilization were particularly vulnerable to these problems. These institutions required constant supplies of food, raw materials, and labor to function. They depended on a complex system of taxation and tribute collection that only worked when the economy was healthy. When climate change reduced agricultural output and earthquakes damaged infrastructure, the whole system began to break down. Palace administrators found it harder to collect what they needed. They could not pay workers or support craftsmen. Trade decreased because there were fewer goods to exchange and fewer resources to pay for imports. The palace-centered economies that had worked so well for centuries suddenly seemed fragile and vulnerable. The unknown century. The collapse did not happen overnight, but unfolded across several generations starting around 1200 BCE. The first signs of trouble appeared in different places.
In Mesopotamia, the impact of the collapse was less severe than in the regions to the west. The great cities of Babylon and Assyria continued to exist, though they faced their own troubles. Assyria went through a difficult period but never collapsed completely. The Assyrian kings maintained their state organization and eventually would expand to create a vast empire. Babylon also survived, though it faced invasions and political instability. The cuneiform writing tradition continued without interruption in Mesopotamia. This continuity meant that knowledge and culture were preserved in these regions that could later spread outward to the recovering areas. Egypt also survived, though greatly weakened and diminished in power and territory. The New Kingdom came to an end, and Egypt entered a period called the Third Intermediate Period, which was marked by political fragmentation and foreign invasions. But Egyptian civilization never completely collapsed. The Egyptian language continued to be written in hieroglyphs. Temples remained centers of religious and cultural life. Pharaohs still ruled, even if their power was limited. The continuity of Egyptian culture meant that later civilizations could look back to Egypt as a source of ancient wisdom and inspiration. The survival of these civilizations, even in diminished form, meant that the light of civilization never completely went out. New peoples rising. As the old empires fell, new groups of people moved into the power vacuum they left behind. Some of these were the mysterious sea peoples who settled in various regions. The Pelazet, who may be the biblical Philistines, settled along the southern coast of the Levant in an area that would become known as Philistia. The Chequer settled further north near the Phoenician cities. These settlers brought new cultural traditions that mixed with surviving local populations to create new hybrid cultures. Archaeological evidence shows both continuities with Bronze Age traditions and innovations that the newcomers introduced. In Anatolia, new groups moved in to replace the vanished Hittites. The Phrygians, who may have come from the Balkans, established a kingdom in central Anatolia. Later, the Lydians would create another kingdom in western Anatolia.
These peoples developed their own distinct cultures that were different from the Hittites, but also borrowed some elements from Bronze Age traditions that survived. The region became a patchwork of different ethnic groups and small kingdoms rather than the unified empire it had been under the Hittites. This fragmentation would characterize Anatolia for many centuries. In Syria and the Levant, a group called the Arameans gradually became dominant. The Arameans were probably nomadic or semi-nomadic people who took advantage of the collapse of urban civilization to move into settled areas. They established small kingdoms and city-states throughout the region. Eventually, the Aramaic language would become the lingua franca of the Near East, replacing Akkadian, which had served that role during the Bronze Age. The Arameans proved to be skilled traders and administrators, and their alphabet would influence many later writing systems, including Hebrew and Arabic. The Age of Iron. One of the most important technological changes to come out of the collapse was the spread of ironworking. Iron had been known during the Bronze Age, but it was rare and expensive, more precious than gold. The Hittites may have known how to work iron more extensively than other peoples, but they guarded the knowledge carefully. When the Hittite Empire collapsed, ironworking knowledge spread more widely. People discovered that iron ore was much more abundant than the copper and especially the tin needed for bronze. Although iron was harder to work than bronze because it required much hotter furnaces, once mastered, it could be produced in greater quantities and at lower cost. The spread of iron technology had revolutionary implications. Bronze weapons and tools were expensive luxuries that only wealthy elites could afford in large quantities. Iron tools and weapons could be produced more cheaply and distributed more widely. A farmer who could never afford a bronze plow could perhaps obtain an iron one. A soldier who had fought with a spear tipped with a bronze point might now have an iron sword. The democratization of metal technology helped transform societies. Power became less concentrated because weaponry became more accessible. Agricultural productivity improved as better iron tools allowed farmers to work the land more effectively. The transition from bronze to iron did not happen overnight. For several centuries, both metals were used together. Bronze remained important for many purposes, and skilled bronze working continued. But gradually, iron became more common and more central to warfare and economy. By around 1000 BCE, iron had become the dominant metal for tools and weapons in most regions. This technological shift marks the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. Some scholars see the spread of iron as one positive development that came out of the collapse, a case where crisis forced innovation and adaptation that eventually led to progress. The Iron Age would see the rise of new kinds of societies and states. The palace-centered economies of the Bronze Age gave way to more diverse economic systems. Trade revived, but in different patterns than before. New cities were founded, sometimes on the sites of destroyed Bronze Age centers, sometimes in new locations. Different political structures emerged, including the Greek city-states that would become so important in later history. The Dark Age was gradually ending, and a new world was being born from the ruins of the old. But the recovery would take centuries, and the memories of the Bronze Age glory would fade into legend. Theories and explanations. Modern scholars have proposed many theories to explain the catastrophic collapse of Bronze Age civilization. Each theory finds support in some evidence, but cannot fully explain everything that happened. The complexity of the collapse suggests that multiple factors probably worked together in a cascade of disasters that reinforced each other. Understanding the various theories helps us appreciate both what we know and what remains mysterious about this crucial period. The climate change theory points to evidence of reduced rainfall and drought in the eastern Mediterranean and Near East around 1200 BCE. Studies of ancient pollen deposits, lake levels, and archaeological sites suggest that climate became drier and less predictable. Agricultural yields would have declined, causing food shortages. Pastoral nomads who depended on grasslands for their herds would have been pushed to migrate to better lands. Increased conflicts over increasingly scarce water and food resources would have increased. A severe drought lasting several decades could destabilize societies that were adapted to wetter conditions. However, climate change alone may not be enough to explain why some regions collapsed completely while others survived. The earthquake theory argues that a series of major earthquakes struck the eastern Mediterranean around this time, destroying cities and disrupting societies. Earthquake damage is evident at many Bronze Age sites. The region sits on active fault lines where earthquakes are common. a cluster of major quakes over several decades could cause massive destruction. However, earthquakes are local disasters that affect specific areas. It is hard to explain a collapse spanning thousands of miles through earthquakes alone unless the quakes disrupted critical nodes in the trade network, causing ripple effects throughout the system. Also, earthquakes had struck the region before without causing civilization to collapse, so something else must have made societies more vulnerable this time. The invasion theory focuses on the sea peoples and other mobile groups who attacked cities and empires. The Egyptian accounts of invasions seem clear, and many sites show evidence of violent destruction. Raiders and invaders could certainly have delivered the final blow to weakened kingdoms. However, the identity and origins of these raiders remain unclear. Were they cause or symptom? Did they cause the collapse by invading, or did they become raiders because their own homelands had collapsed? The invasion theory struggles to explain why so many different regions collapsed at roughly the same time, unless the invaders were truly massive in number and extraordinarily well organized.
Perhaps the most compelling explanation is what scholars call the systems collapse theory. This theory argues that Bronze Age civilization had become a complex, interconnected system, and when critical parts of that system failed, the whole network collapsed in a cascade of disasters. The late Bronze Age economy depended on long-distance trade to supply critical resources. Cyprus provided copper. Regions far to the east or north provided tin. Neither copper nor tin alone was useful for making bronze, but together they created the metal that armed armies and equipped craftsmen. If trade routes were disrupted, bronze could not be produced. Without bronze, the military and economic systems would fail. The palace-centered economies were also vulnerable to disruption. These systems depended on everything working smoothly. Farmers had to produce surpluses to feed craftsmen and administrators. Craftsmen had to produce goods for trade. Traders had to obtain foreign resources. Tax collectors had to gather enough to support the palace. If any link in this chain broke, the whole system could unravel. A drought that reduced harvests could start a process where less food meant fewer craftsmen could be supported, which meant less production, which meant less trade, which meant fewer resources, which meant military weakness, which invited attack. Each problem made other problems worse in a spiral of decline. The very interconnection that had made the Bronze Age world so prosperous also made it fragile. When problems appeared in one region, they spread to others through the trade network. If Syria was attacked and trade routes through that region were disrupted, Cyprus lost markets for its copper, and Egypt lost access to timber from Lebanon. If drought struck Anatolia, the Hittites might have raided Syria for food, destabilizing that region. If earthquakes destroyed key port cities, maritime trade declined, affecting everyone who depended on it. The system had no redundancy, no backup plan. Everything depended on everything else continuing to work. When multiple shocks hit roughly simultaneously, the system could not absorb them and instead collapsed catastrophically. This systems collapse theory also explains why recovery took so long. Once the complex system broke down, it could not easily be rebuilt. The knowledge and institutions that made the system work were lost. Trade networks that had taken generations to establish disappeared in the chaos. Populations declined so much that there were not enough people to rebuild what had been lost. The survivors had to start almost from scratch, building simpler, more local systems that could survive without depending on distant trade and complex organization. Only gradually, over many centuries, would the connectivity and complexity of the Bronze Age be recreated. Echoes in memory. Although the Bronze Age collapse happened more than 3,000 years ago, its echoes reached far into later history. The ancient Greeks preserved memories of the Mycenaean period in their legends and mythology. The story of the Trojan War, as told by Homer in the Iliad, probably reflects some distant memory of the Bronze Age world, even though Homer lived hundreds of years after the collapse, and the story had been transformed through generations of oral retelling. The heroes of Greek legend, with their bronze weapons and massive palaces, reflect a dimly remembered past that seemed grander than the simpler world of the early Iron Age. The collapse may have influenced the development of monotheistic religion in the Near East. The ancient Israelites were developing their distinctive belief in one God at around the same time as the collapse of the old empires in their many gods. Some scholars have suggested that the collapse of the old empires and their many gods created space for new religious ideas. When the great powers fell and their gods seemed unable to save them, perhaps it became easier to imagine a different kind of God, who transcended earthly kingdoms. The biblical stories of the Exodus and the conquest of Canaan may reflect, in transformed form, the upheavals of the collapse period. The memory of the collapse also served as a warning to later civilizations. The idea that great empires could fall and knowledge could be lost became part of the cultural consciousness of the Mediterranean world. Roman writers living in a mighty empire sometimes wondered if Rome too might fall as the ancient kingdoms had fallen. Medieval scholars in Europe, looking at Roman ruins, knew that their ancestors had once built greater things but had lost the knowledge. The collapse reminded people that civilization is fragile and that what seems permanent can disappear. In modern times, the Bronze Age collapse has taken on new relevance. We live in a globalized world with complex, interconnected systems, much like the late Bronze Age. Resources flow across vast distances through supply chains that depend on everything working smoothly. Our civilization relies on specialized knowledge and complex technology. Some scholars warn that our modern world could be vulnerable to the same kind of systems collapse that destroyed Bronze Age civilization. Climate change, political instability, pandemics, and economic disruptions could potentially combine to create a cascade of failures. The ancient collapse serves as both a historical puzzle to solve and a cautionary tale for our own time. What survived? Despite the devastation of the collapse, not everything was lost. Some traditions, technologies, and ideas survived the Dark Age and passed into later civilizations. The alphabet, one of humanity's most important inventions, was developed by people living in the Levant during or shortly before the collapse. The Phoenicians preserved and spread alphabetic writing through the Dark Age. Unlike earlier writing systems that required learning hundreds of symbols, the alphabet could be learned quickly by anyone. This democratic technology would eventually spread throughout the world. The Greeks adapted the Phoenician alphabet to their own language around 800 BCE, adding vowels to create the first true phonetic writing system. From the Greek alphabet came the Latin alphabet, used to write this script. Ironworking technology, as already discussed, spread during and after the collapse. This technology would transform human society as thoroughly as bronze had done earlier. The Iron Age would see the rise of great empires like Assyria, Persia, and Rome. Iron tools would allow farmers to cultivate more land more efficiently. Iron weapons would change warfare. The wide availability of iron compared to bronze would help break down some of the rigid social hierarchies of the Bronze Age. While the collapse destroyed much, the spread of ironworking was an innovation that came through the crisis. Religious and philosophical ideas also survived and evolved through the Dark Age. Monotheistic concepts that emerged in the Near East during this period would eventually give rise to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The Greek gods, whose worship continued through the Dark Age, would inspire classical Greek religion and philosophy. The Egyptian and Mesopotamian religious traditions maintained continuity that preserved ancient knowledge and wisdom. These spiritual and intellectual traditions provided meaning and structure to human life, even when material civilization declined. They would shape the worldviews of billions of people in later centuries. Heroic legends and oral traditions carried memories of the Bronze Age forward. The stories that Homer and other poets would eventually write down preserved, in transformed form, knowledge of Mycenaean Greece. Other cultures maintained similar oral traditions. These legends served multiple purposes. They entertained people with exciting stories. They provided models of heroic behavior for later generations to emulate. They maintained cultural identity and continuity with the past. And they preserved, however imperfectly, information about a vanished world. When archaeologists began excavating Bronze Age sites in modern times, they found that the legends contained kernels of historical truth mixed with mythology. The recovery begins. Gradually, slowly, over many generations, the Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds began to recover from the catastrophe of the collapse. The process was uneven, starting earlier in some places than others. In the Levant, the Phoenician cities led the revival. By around 1000 BCE, Phoenician merchants were once again sailing throughout the Mediterranean, re-establishing trade networks. They founded trading posts and colonies on Cyprus, in North Africa, in Sicily, and eventually as far west as Spain. The city of Carthage, which would later challenge Rome, began as a Phoenician colony. Phoenician ships brought goods, ideas, and technologies to regions that had been isolated during the Dark Age. In Greece, recovery took longer. The Greek Dark Age lasted from roughly 1100 to 800 BCE, some 300 years of low material culture and limited contact with the outside world. But even during these centuries, important developments were happening. The Greeks were spreading from the mainland to colonize islands throughout the Aegean and the coast of Anatolia. They were mixing with other populations to create new hybrid cultures. They were developing new forms of social organization, including early versions of the city-states that would become so important. And they were maintaining oral traditions that would form the basis of Greek literature. Around 800 BCE, the Greeks encountered the Phoenician alphabet and adapted it to write their own language. This reintroduction of literacy to Greece was a turning point. For the first time in centuries, Greeks could write things down. Within a short time, someone wrote down the Homeric poems, preserving them for all future generations. The ability to write allowed Greeks to develop more complex governments, to record laws, to keep business accounts, to compose literature and philosophy. Literacy was a catalyst that helped accelerate Greece's emergence from the Dark Age into what would become the Archaic period, and then the Classical period of Greek civilization. New empires also rose in the Near East. The Assyrians, who had survived the collapse in weakened form, gradually rebuilt their power. By the 9th century BCE, they were expanding aggressively, conquering neighboring peoples and demanding tribute. The Neo-Assyrian Empire would become the first true superpower to dominate the entire Near East since the Bronze Age. The Assyrians were ruthlessly efficient conquerors who pioneered new forms of military organization and imperial administration. Their empire was brutal but effective, and it created a framework of roads, administration, and trade that would benefit later empires. New patterns of civilization. The civilizations that emerged from the Dark Age were different in important ways from those of the Bronze Age. Political organization became more varied. Instead of the palace-centered kingdoms of the Bronze Age, the Iron Age saw the development of new forms, including Greek city-states, Phoenician merchant republics, and large territorial empires like Assyria and Persia. Economic systems became more diverse and flexible. Trade revived, but in new patterns with multiple centers rather than depending on palace bureaucracies. Money was invented, eventually replacing barter and making trade easier. Markets became important institutions where ordinary people could buy and sell. Social structures also changed. The rigid hierarchies of the Bronze Age, where kings and priests controlled most resources, gave way to somewhat more fluid societies. In Greek city-states, though hardly democratic by modern standards, citizens had voices in government that ordinary Bronze Age subjects never possessed. Merchants and craftsmen who prospered through trade could achieve wealth and status independent of royal favor. Literacy became more widespread as alphabetic writing was easier to learn than Bronze Age scripts. Education spread beyond narrow scribal elites. These changes created societies with more social mobility and diversity than the Bronze Age world.
Technology and knowledge advanced in new directions. The spread of ironworking has already been mentioned. Shipbuilding improved, allowing vessels to sail farther and carry more cargo. Navigation techniques advanced. Agriculture became more productive through better tools and techniques. Craftsmen developed new technologies in glassmaking, textile production, and metalworking. Architecture evolved, with Greeks developing their distinctive temple styles and other peoples creating their own impressive structures. The knowledge lost in the collapse was not just recovered, but eventually surpassed as new generations made their own discoveries. Cultural and intellectual life flourished in new ways. The Greeks developed philosophy, seeking to understand the world through reason rather than mythology alone. Literature evolved beyond heroic poetry to include history, drama, and personal poetry. Science began to emerge from natural philosophy. In the Near East, the Hebrew prophets developed ethical monotheism, with its emphasis on justice and moral behavior. Zoroastrianism in Persia explored ideas of cosmic struggle between good and evil. These Iron Age developments in thought and culture would profoundly influence all later civilizations. The Dark Age had destroyed the Bronze Age world, but the recovery had created something new and in many ways more dynamic. Rediscovering the lost world. For many centuries after the collapse, the Bronze Age was almost completely forgotten. Later civilizations knew the legends but did not understand that they reflected real historical events. The Greeks of the classical period had only vague ideas about Mycenaean civilization. They could see the ruins of massive walls but did not know who had built them. Medieval and Renaissance Europeans knew about ancient Egypt and classical Greece and Rome, but they had no concept of the Bronze Age. The great civilizations that had flourished before 1200 BCE were lost to history. The rediscovery of the Bronze Age began in the 19th century when archaeologists started excavating ancient sites. Heinrich Schliemann, a German businessman turned archaeologist, made sensational discoveries at Troy and Mycenae in the 1870s. Though his excavation methods were crude by modern standards, he proved that the Homeric legends were based on real places. Arthur Evans, excavating in Crete starting in 1900, uncovered the Minoan civilization that had been completely unknown. These and other archaeologists revealed that a sophisticated civilization had existed long before classical Greece. In Anatolia, excavations beginning in the early 20th century uncovered the Hittite capital and the vast archives of clay tablets written in cuneiform. Scholars painstakingly deciphered the Hittite language and discovered an empire that had been totally forgotten. The Bible mentions Hittites as one of the peoples living in Canaan, but until archaeologists found their capital, no one knew they had created a great empire. The diplomatic correspondence between Hittite kings and Egyptian pharaohs revealed the complex international relations of the late Bronze Age. The discovery of the Amarna letters in Egypt provided another window into the Bronze Age world. These clay tablets, found at the site of Pharaoh Akhenaten's short-lived capital, contained diplomatic correspondence between Egypt and other kingdoms. The letters showed that the Bronze Age had seen regular diplomatic contact between great powers. They revealed details about trade, royal marriages, and political negotiations. Together with evidence from archaeological excavations across the Mediterranean and Near East, these discoveries revealed a lost world that had been far more sophisticated and interconnected than anyone had imagined. Modern mysteries remain. Despite more than 100 years of archaeological work and scholarly research, many mysteries about the Bronze Age collapse remain unsolved. We still do not know for certain who the Sea Peoples were or where they came from. We cannot identify all the groups mentioned in Egyptian texts with known historical peoples. The exact relationship between the various disasters, whether climate change caused migrations that led to invasions, or whether invasions disrupted systems that led to climate-related famines, remains debated. New evidence continues to emerge that sometimes clarifies and sometimes complicates our understanding. Modern scientific techniques are providing new kinds of evidence. DNA analysis of ancient human remains can tell us about population movements and relationships between different peoples. Chemical analysis of artifacts can reveal where materials came from and how they were made. Climate scientists studying ancient tree rings, ice cores, and sediment layers can reconstruct past climate conditions with increasing precision. Computer modeling helps scholars understand how complex systems might collapse. But even with these powerful tools, much remains uncertain because the evidence is fragmentary and the events happened so long ago.
The debate continues about whether the Bronze Age collapse was caused primarily by human actions like warfare or by natural disasters like climate change and earthquakes. Most scholars now believe that multiple factors interacted in complex ways. A severe drought might not by itself cause collapse, but combined with earthquakes, invasions, and systemic vulnerabilities, it could trigger a catastrophe. The exact sequence of events and which factors were most important may never be fully known. What we do know is that the collapse was rapid, devastating, and changed the course of human history. The Bronze Age collapse also raises important questions about our own civilization. Could a similar collapse happen today? Our globalized world depends on complex supply chains and interconnected systems, much like the Bronze Age. We face potential threats from climate change, pandemics, political instability, and economic disruption. Some scholars warn that system complexity creates fragility. Others argue that modern technology, knowledge, and institutions make us more resilient than ancient civilizations. The debate continues, but the ancient collapse reminds us that civilizations can fail, and that we should not take our own stability for granted.
The story of the unknown century teaches important lessons that remain relevant thousands of years later. First, it reminds us that civilization is not inevitable or permanent. Societies that seem strong and sophisticated can collapse if conditions change and they cannot adapt. The Bronze Age kingdoms appeared powerful and stable, but they proved vulnerable to a combination of challenges. Modern society should be humble about their own strength and aware of potential vulnerabilities. We should work to make our systems more resilient and sustainable, rather than assuming that what we have built will last forever. Second, the collapse shows the danger of over-specialization and over-dependence on complex systems. The Bronze Age palace economies were efficient when everything worked properly, but they had no backup plans and no redundancy. When the system broke down, people lacked the skills and resources to survive independently. Modern societies face similar risks. If supply chains break down or electrical grids fail, many people would struggle because we have lost simpler skills that our ancestors possessed. Building resilience means maintaining diversity and flexibility rather than optimizing for efficiency alone. Third, the recovery from the collapse demonstrates human resilience and adaptability. Even after catastrophic collapse, survivors rebuilt. It took centuries, but eventually new civilizations rose that in many ways surpassed what had been lost. Human creativity and determination can overcome even terrible setbacks. This should give us hope that if we face major challenges, whether from climate change, resource depletion, or other crises, humanity has the capacity to adapt and survive. We should not be paralyzed by fear of collapse, but rather work to prevent it while maintaining confidence in human resilience. Fourth, the interconnection of ancient civilizations shows that humans have long been connected across vast distances. Even 3,000 years ago, events in one region affected people thousands of miles away. Today we are even more interconnected, which means we must think globally about problems and solutions. Climate change, pandemics, economic crises, and other challenges affect everyone. No nation can solve these problems alone. The Bronze Age collapse happened partly because problems spread through an interconnected system. But connection also offers opportunities for cooperation and mutual support. We must learn to work together across boundaries to address shared challenges. The unknown century in perspective. Placing the unknown century in the broader sweep of human history helps us understand its significance. Human civilization had been developing for thousands of years before the Bronze Age. Agriculture had begun around 10,000 BCE. Cities had emerged around 3,500 BCE in Mesopotamia. Writing had been invented shortly after. By 2000 BCE, complex civilizations existed in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and China. The Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean civilization was part of this broader development of human culture. The collapse around 1200 BCE was not the end of civilization, but rather a regional catastrophe that interrupted development in one part of the world. In other regions, civilization continued without such dramatic collapse.
China experienced its own changes and dynasties, but did not suffer a complete breakdown comparable to the Mediterranean collapse. The Indus Valley civilization had already declined earlier, but cultures in the Indian subcontinent continued to develop. The Americas saw their own independent development of civilization that would not encounter the Old World for another 3,000 years. The Bronze Age collapse was a major event for the peoples it affected, but human civilization as a whole continued. This perspective reminds us that while regional collapses can be devastating for those experiencing them, humanity, as a whole, is resilient. The collapse also represents a transition between two eras of human development. The Bronze Age was characterized by palace-centered economies, relatively limited literacy, and dependence on bronze technology. The Iron Age that emerged from the collapse saw more diverse political and economic systems, wider literacy through alphabetic writing, and the spread of iron technology. Some features of classical civilization that we often admire, like Greek democracy and philosophy, emerged from the world that developed after the collapse. In this sense, the unknown century was not just an ending, but also a beginning, a transition that, despite its trauma, helped create the conditions for new achievements. We should also remember that ordinary people lived through the collapse and the recovery. While we focus on the fall of empires and the loss of palaces, real human beings experienced these events. Families struggled to find food during famines. Refugees fled from destroyed cities searching for safety. Parents tried to protect their children in times of violence and chaos. Survivors rebuilt their lives in the aftermath of disaster. Eventually, people in the recovering world fell in love, raised families, practiced their trades, and tried to make sense of the world. The grand historical events we study from a distance were made up of countless individual human stories of suffering, survival, and hope. The legacy lives on. The influence of the Bronze Age and its collapse continues to shape our world in subtle ways. The alphabetic writing system that survived and spread after the collapse is the ancestor of most modern writing systems. The Latin alphabet used for English and many other languages, the Cyrillic alphabet used for Russian and related languages, the Arabic script used across the Islamic world, and many others all ultimately derive from the Phoenician alphabet that passed through the Dark Age. Every time we write, we use a technology that survived the ancient catastrophe. The religious traditions that emerged from the collapse period continue to shape billions of lives. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all trace their roots to the Near East in the aftermath of the Bronze Age world. The ethical monotheism that developed during and after the collapse, with its emphasis on justice, compassion, and moral behavior, profoundly influences modern values even for people who are not religious. The very concept of universal human rights has roots in religious and philosophical traditions that emerged from this period. The spiritual legacy of the unknown century remains powerful. The Greek culture that eventually emerged from the collapse of Mycenaean civilization became foundational for Western civilization. Greek philosophy, literature, art, architecture, and political thought continued to influence education and culture worldwide. The scientific method, democratic ideals, and rational inquiry that characterize modern civilization owe much to the Greeks. And the Greeks themselves built on foundations that included dim memories of the Bronze Age preserved in legend. The great achievements of classical Greece would not have happened without the collapse that preceded it and shaped the world in which Greek civilization developed. And even our archaeological and historical sciences were shaped by the rediscovery of the Bronze Age. The excavation of Mycenae, Troy, Knossos, and other sites helped develop modern archaeological methods. The decipherment of Linear B and Hittite cuneiform advanced the science of linguistics. The study of the collapse has contributed to our understanding of how complex societies function and fail. Interdisciplinary research combining archaeology, climatology, economics, and other fields to understand the collapse has become a model for studying other historical periods. The unknown century continues to teach us not just about the past, but about how to study the past. Conclusion: emerging from darkness. The unknown century stands as one of the most dramatic and mysterious periods in all of human history. For 100 years or more, between roughly 1200 and 1100 BCE, The civilized world of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East seemed to collapse into chaos and darkness. Great empires that had ruled for centuries vanished almost overnight. Cities that had flourished for generations were destroyed and abandoned. Trade networks that had connected distant lands fell apart. Writing disappeared from entire regions. Knowledge and skills that had taken generations to develop were lost. The population declined drastically as people died or scattered. The sophisticated, interconnected world of the Late Bronze Age gave way to a simpler, more isolated existence during the Dark Age that followed.
The causes of this catastrophe remain debated. Climate change probably played a role, with drought and reduced rainfall causing food shortages and forcing migrations. Earthquakes may have destroyed key cities and disrupted societies. Invasions by groups the Egyptians called Sea Peoples certainly contributed to the violence and destruction. But beyond these specific factors, the collapse seems to have resulted from the breakdown of a complex, interconnected system that could not withstand multiple shocks hitting simultaneously. The very features that made the Bronze Age civilization successful, its specialization and interconnection, also made it vulnerable. When critical parts of the system failed, the whole network collapsed in a cascade of disasters. Yet the story of the unknown century is not only about destruction and loss, it is also about survival and recovery. Some regions and cities weathered the storm better than others. Important technologies like alphabetic writing and ironworking survived and spread. Religious and cultural traditions maintained continuity, even as material civilization declined. Most importantly, the people who lived through the collapse did not give up. Survivors rebuilt their lives and communities. Over many generations, new civilizations emerged from the ruins of the old. These Iron Age civilizations were different from their Bronze Age predecessors, often more flexible and dynamic. From the darkness came eventual renewal. The recovery took centuries, but it did happen. The Phoenicians recreated Mediterranean trade networks. The Greeks emerged from their Dark Age to create one of history's most influential civilizations. New empires rose in the Near East. Literacy returned and eventually became more widespread than before. Technology advanced with the spread of ironworking. Art, literature, philosophy, and science would eventually reach levels that surpassed the Bronze Age. The collapse had been devastating, but it was not final. Human creativity and resilience proved stronger than any catastrophe. For us today, living more than 3,000 years after these events, the unknown century offers both a mystery to ponder and a lesson to learn. The mystery remains unsolved in many of its details. We still debate who the Sea Peoples were and exactly what role they played. We argue about whether climate change or human conflict was more important. We try to understand exactly how and why the complex Bronze Age system collapsed so completely. New archaeological discoveries and scientific techniques continue to provide evidence, but many questions may never be fully answered. The unknown century lives up to its name. The lessons, however, are clear. Civilizations are not permanent or inevitable. What humans build, however impressive, can be destroyed if conditions change and societies cannot adapt. Complex systems can be efficient but also fragile. Over-specialization and over-dependence create vulnerabilities. At the same time, humans are remarkably resilient and creative. Even after catastrophic collapse, survivors rebuild. Knowledge may be lost but can be rediscovered. New civilizations can rise from the ruins of old ones, sometimes creating things even greater than what was lost. The unknown century teaches us both humility about our own civilization's vulnerability and confidence in humanity's ability to survive and recover from even terrible disasters. As we face our own challenges in the modern world, from climate change to political instability to pandemics to economic disruptions, the story of the Bronze Age collapse remains relevant. Our interconnected global civilization shares some of the vulnerabilities that made the Bronze Age world fragile. We depend on complex systems that could potentially fail in cascading disasters. But we also have advantages the ancients lacked, including scientific knowledge, technology, and global communication.
If we learn from the past, we can work to make our civilization more resilient while maintaining the benefits of our interconnected world. The unknown century reminds us that the work of building and maintaining civilization never ends, that each generation must face its challenges with wisdom, courage, and cooperation. The darkness of those mysterious 100 years eventually gave way to light. The civilizations that emerged from the collapse would achieve great things. They would build on what survived from the Bronze Age while creating much that was new. The Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds would become the cradle of Western civilization, contributing ideas and innovations that shaped the entire modern world. None of this would have happened without the collapse and the long recovery that followed. The unknown century was both an ending and a beginning, a tragedy and an opportunity. Its story reminds us that even in the darkest times, the human spirit endures, and from destruction can come eventual renewal. The ancient catastrophe teaches us that civilizations rise and fall, but humanity continues, always adapting, always rebuilding, always reaching toward a better future.